Why is it that we find ourselves overcome by anger sometimes in inappropriate moments? Why is it that we're sometimes haunted by an unnameable dread or anxiety? Why is it that things get surprising reactions? Why is it that it feels like there's more going on inside our head than is immediately accessible? These are some of the questions that were explored by Sigmund Freud and other psychoanalysts. And it's part of what has made their work interesting to a lot of literary critics, because one of the things that literature is about is what it's like to be a person. One of the reasons we make art is to express these experiences. And, going back to the ancient world, Aristotle talked about going to the theater and experiencing art and literature as being a catharsis, which is a medical term. It's a term for cleansing or purging of negative emotions, right? So there's a psychological, therapeutic use for literature. Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, talked about words as medicine for the soul. And so I'm Dr. Jonathan Newman. This is Introductory Lectures on Literary Theory, and we're going to talk today about psychoanalysis and psychological criticism. All right, so we're going to focus in this video on our buddy Sigmund Freud, who is apparently, according to an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education yesterday, back. Freud is back. Freud comes and goes, but Freud always seems to return. And in some ways, Freud never left, because you may not realize this, but still in 2023, 90 close to 85 years after Freud's death, his ideas are still everywhere. If you've ever heard somebody talk about a behavior as a defense mechanism, if you've ever heard somebody talk about repression or neurosis or identification, right? Like, I identify with that person. Or if you've ever heard the terms phallic symbol, or that popular trinity of id, ego, and superego. If you've ever heard somebody described as a narcissist, or the term Oedipus Complex, or indeed a fetish, or a phallic symbol. I said that already. I wonder if that's a Freudian slip. Oh, there's another one. What about the idea of compensating, right? Like, you see somebody in a giant Dodge Ram truck and wonder if they're compensating for something. That idea of compensation for a sense of a phallic injury or castration anxiety or something like that. That idea that other things that we do in the world are connected in some way to our psychosexual experience of our own bodies and selves is all coming from Sigmund Freud. And even if we don't like Freud, he's still with us. Also the term uncanny, or the Unheimlich, which is a popular one for people who study horror as a genre. I'm not going to get into that in this video. But yeah, Freud's everywhere. Also, one of his students who kind of moved off in a different direction, named Alfred Adler, developed ideas we still use constantly as well, like the inferiority complex, the superiority complex. If you've ever heard somebody's personality attributed in some sense to birth order, like, oh, that's such a youngest child thing to do, you're talking the language of Alfred Adler. Okay, here's the one that really blows my mind. The term lifestyle was invented by Alfred Adler. I thought that was something that that always existed, but no, these are all from Adler. So Freud is really, really influential, but other psychoanalysts and psychologists working in the 20th century, not just Adler, have also had a significant effect on our culture, on what I like to think of as our mental furniture, as our, or I think W.H. Auden, the poet, called it. Freud isn't just like a set of ideas, it's a whole climate of opinion, right? All right, so let's get into what we're going to talk about in this video today. We're going to talk about psychological criticism. What is it and why should we do it? What is psychoanalytical criticism specifically? What is the difference between psychology more broadly and psychoanalysis more narrowly? What are the major principles of Freudian psychoanalysis? This video is going to focus on Freud, but we're also going to take a look at some other psychoanalytical thinkers and critics to see what the legacy of Freud has been over the 20th and into the 21st century. Let's go. All right, psychological criticism is using psychological theory and asking psychological questions, kind of a circular definition. But, what motivates people? What are the personality traits? What emotional responses do we bring to things? How do we conduct our relationships with other people, and so on? So one question a psychological critic might ask is, what psychological needs does reading literature fulfill? What about writing it? Why do people do this? Another thing that psychological critics can do is to take the works of specific psychologists and apply them to reading texts. So Freud or Jung. Jung has had a bit of a revival based on a certain other Canadian professor associated with the University of Toronto / Disney adult who I think kind of has a pretty reductive reading of Jung. But Jung's not my thing anyway. I find him kind of mystical. Melanie Klein, Karen Horney, Erik Erikson, and Abraham Maslow are all influential psychologists who have influenced how people think about a whole range of human experience. And so you could apply their ideas about personality traits, relationships, motivations, responses to reading literature, to understanding characters. Why do characters react the way they do? How do characters' lives and backgrounds influence their actions? What fears and nervous tics do the actions have, and why? Do the characters have, and why? What kinds of personalities do they have? Why? The idea of personality itself is a psychological concept, one that has been formed by psychologists, right? Okay. Next, we're going to talk specifically about psychoanalytical criticism. And psychoanalysis is not the same thing as psychology. Psychoanalysis is a kind of depth psychology. And depth psychology works from the assumption that not everything that we think or feel is intelligible or legible to us. There's an idea that we have these deep hidden feelings, hidden memories, hidden desires that a psychoanalyst, for example, through analysis can uncover and make legible to the person. Psychoanalysis is not classical Freudian psychoanalysis is not a clinical practice anymore, generally speaking. There is a particular type of therapy called psychodynamic theory, which has its roots in Freudian psychoanalysis. But, there are still Freudian and Lacanian and other kinds of psychoanalysts practicing, but it's kind of a niche thing. And here's the thing. Insurance doesn't cover it because its benefits are not often measurable, and insurance companies like educational assessors like measurable outcomes. So one of the things that psychoanalytic criticism does is focus on the author. Another is to focus on the characters. Another is to focus on the culture and see how a text can represent the hidden drives and neurosis and anxieties, not just of specific people, but of the culture to which a text belongs. And this is the Louis Althusser, who we'll mention briefly later, but we'll talk about more about him in the Marxism episode, talks about this as a symptomatic reading, where we take the text as being a symptom of the culture to which it belongs. Althusser is a Marxist, of course, but Paul Ricoeur was a Catholic critic, and he talked about psychoanalysis, along with Marxism, as a hermeneutic of suspicion. That is, you're suspicious of the text. You always believe that it's not telling you what it really means, that there are secrets that you have to uncover, that the heroic critic aren't equipped with the skills and the techniques and the methods and the terminology will uncover. And Ricoeur was in some ways suspicious of suspicion. The new critics didn't like psychoanalytic criticism because they saw it as not literary criticism. They see, psychology is its own domain, literary criticism is another domain, and if you're using texts to talk about psychoanalytic concepts, you're not doing literary criticism. This is extrinsic criticism. The new critics said we should do intrinsic criticism, just focus on the text. What's interesting, though, is that there's a kind of similarity between the new critics and psychoanalytic critics in that they both come from the assumption that everything is significant. Freud once said that there is nothing random about the psyche and what the psyche does. And so this is why the idea of a Freudian slip, right? If you say the wrong word, it's not just random. It's not meaningless. It's always a disclosure of some kind of what? Well, of the unconscious mind. This is the most crucial and key idea in Freudian psychoanalysis, and it's an idea that has continued to influence psychology, even as Freudianism has mostly been rejected by mainstream psychological practitioners. The idea of repressed memories, the idea of triggerable traumatic stress, all of these connect in some way to the idea that we have memories, emotions, thoughts that are not available to us. The unconscious mind is a reservoir of feelings, thoughts, urges, and memories outside of our conscious awareness. You can't just like walk into the library of your mind and take that book off your shelf. It is locked down. And so Freud's idea was you would come and sit in his study here, go lay down on that couch and look at all his knickknacks while he sat there in that chair next to you with a notepad and just listen to you talk about your mother or whatever. So what is in the unconscious mind? Repressed feelings, automatic skills, right? If I throw a ball at you and you catch it all of a sudden, that is your unconscious at work. You're not telling yourself consciously, I will raise my arm and put my hand like this. The unconscious also includes subliminal perceptions. This was a big deal for advertisers in the 1950s, if you've ever watched Mad Men. Thoughts, we repress thoughts. We have unconscious habits, things that we do that we don't even know we do. We have automatic reactions, right? Somebody cuts you off when you're driving and all of a sudden you're just so angry. And like, why? Where did that come from? Hidden phobias. Why are you afraid of spiders? Why are you afraid of thunder? Why are you afraid of dogs? And why does it just pop out at you all of a sudden? You don't even know why. It doesn't make sense to you, right? And likewise, why are you attracted to specific things that don't make sense to you, right? And also another aspect, and we'll get into this a little later, but certain complexes, arrangements of fears, desires that kind of help form our personality are also part of the unconscious. So Freud compared the unconscious to an iceberg. The mind he compared to an iceberg. Most of it is below the surface of consciousness. The things that we think and are aware that we're thinking and feeling and wanting is just the tip of the iceberg. And so he developed various models to explain how the mind and the psyche and the personality actually are structured. The early one was developed in the interpretation of dreams in 1900 and in formulations on 2 principles of mental functioning in 1911. And this posits that we have a pleasure principle. And the pleasure principle is the idea that impulses need to be fulfilled immediately, that we have a need for physical and emotional gratification. This is one of the core drives that motivates us. We want pleasure. We want to feel good. We want our needs met. However, at war with the pleasure principle is the reality principle. Well, if it isn't the consequences of my own actions, as the meme goes, is an illustration of the reality principle at work. Reality principle is the recognition of the demands of reality, the fear of consequences, social, physical, and emotional. I think you can read Shakespeare's comedies often as a staging of the war between the pleasure principle and the reality principle, where you have the young lovers who are seeking their gratification, but also have the demands of angry fathers in society who are trying to prevent these things. And so in a comedy in Shakespeare, like in Twelfth Night or something like that, or in Midsummer Night's Dream, they go off into a realm of kind of pleasure and chaos, but come back and are reintegrated into reality. Now, in a tragedy, those who seek pleasure are end up being punished and destroyed by the reality principle. But for Freud, the development of a healthy and mature personality depended on finding a balance between the two. This is the early model. He later revised it, and I'm not sure if he improved it, but he revised it to the more familiar triadic model of the id, ego, and superego. This remained superego. This remained the fundamental template until he died in 1939 in exile in London. According to this, the human mind has three provinces. There's the realm of the id, which is Latin for it, which is impulse, desire, and pleasure. There is the ego, which is a sense of self. It is realistic. It is self-narrating. And there is the superego, which is a part of our mind that is partly on the it kind of bridges the conscious and the unconscious mind. The ego is all in the conscious. The id is all in the unconscious. The id is the urges of our body. And the superego is partly unconscious because we might have internalized prohibitions or repressions that we're not aware of, but which are still acting on us, that prevent us from gratifying our desires or from acting in ways sometimes that will that are rationally self-serving. And so the ego is kind of the referee between these two warring forces. And so this is the basic model. And so the psyche is not a stable model, but it's a dynamic structure. It's a constant struggle between the id, which says, I want it now, gimme, 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 it will make me feel good forever. And the superego, which says, no, that is forbidden, you will be punished, no. And then we get the ego who says, hey, let's make a deal. This is a reference that's even older than I am. Maybe we can come to a compromise. Let's work something out, right? Like, oh, you have that cookie now, and then you'll do an extra 15 minutes on the treadmill tomorrow or something. Well, whatever it is, right? And so that there's this kind of tension between these elements that's always being negotiated. It's never stable. This is part of life. And so the personality emerges from these aspects of the psyche. Personality is shaped by early childhood experience. This is one of the key sort of axioms of psychoanalysis, and especially Freudian psychoanalysis. In the psychoanalytical view, early childhood experience inevitably involves disappointment, loss, and trauma, right? Just that the fundamental realization that you're separate from your mother's body, and that you're not going to get your needs met all the time, that the world does not exist for you alone. As you come to realize, as you enter into language and as you enter into society, and you're not just sort of this chaotic little like goblin, that you come to realize that the world kind of sucks. And this realization is itself traumatic, and it's a trauma that we all share. And so the psyche responds to unpleasant and unacceptable thoughts, the desire to strangle your sibling because they're taking your mother's attention or something like that. Unpleasant and unacceptable thoughts are repressed with defense mechanisms. And the most important among these, there's a number of them. The most important ones are repression and reaction formation. Repression is when you forget or ignore something that makes you anxious or uncomfortable. Reaction formation is when you do the opposite of what you really feel or want. Now, a lot of people think Freud is nonsense, but when you read this stuff, you're like, there's a sense of recognition that we encounter these ideas with. They're like, yeah, that feels like something that's real. But the thing to remember is that these are unconscious processes, not intentional actions. Repression doesn't work by deciding, I'm going to repress this and not think about it. In fact, if you notice, it kind of works the opposite. When you try not to think about something, it comes back, right? So let's talk about character in a literary context and personality. Because character is something that I think is approachable from a Freudian or a psychoanalytical perspective. One of the basic theories of personality in psychoanalysis is the idea of the complex. And a complex is a core pattern of emotions, perceptions and wishes in the personality organized around a common theme. For Freud, the complex is inevitable. It gives stability to the ongoing struggle at the core of the personality, which we saw already between id and ego and superego. A healthy personality achieves a harmonious balance between unconscious drives and demands through the resolution of a complex. An unhealthy or maladaptive personality suffers from imbalances and fixations. Now, Freud was a doctor, and he really saw what he was doing as medicine, and he saw psychological suffering as an ailment that he wanted to heal. He thought what he was doing was science. And he also, and as a scientist, as a medical practitioner, he saw the creation or the cultivation of a healthy, adaptive, normal personality as desirable and healing. So he had very different ideas in a lot of ways from what a lot of people now will think about, for example, sexuality and gender. He saw any diversion from heterosexuality and cisgender identity as being mental illness, right? And this continued to be the case until the 1970s, that the American Psychological Association viewed homosexuality as a mental illness. And this question of mental illness and medicalization is still kind of in our debates over, for example, trans identity now. So understand that when I'm explaining Freud to you right now, because I'm about to get into the Oedipus complex, understand that I'm teaching you. I'm not trying to convince you that this is real. I am not convinced in any way myself. I think part of it is kind of silly, but I think it's worth understanding because it casts such a huge shadow over the intellectual and literary and cultural life of the 20th century. So let's talk about the Oedipus complex. Woohoo! All right, so according to Freud, and by the way, we're going to be talking about incest here, so if that's not something that you're in a place where you really want to hear about, skip forward a few slides, all right? Just fast forward to about 2-3 chapters from now. Or no, to the next chapter. Right. The Oedipus complex is a repression of the childhood wish to displace the parent of our own sex and take his or her place in the affections of the parent of the opposite sex. The mother is the parent who primarily gratifies the child's desire. An infant is fed by the mother, comforted by the mother. And I think it's important to remember that Freud is developing this theory in the context of the bourgeois nuclear family of late 19th century, early 20th century Vienna. The child, to Freud, begins forming a discrete sexual identity as boy or girl as they become aware of the differences of their body that alters the dynamics of the parent and child relationship. And the parents become the objects of infantile libido. Now, libido means, in a narrow sense, sexual desire, lust, whatever you want to call it. But in a broader sense, it's attached to the sense of like a kind of general life force or a general kind of feeling of desire that isn't understood or regulated. And this is one of the more controversial things about Freud's ideas these days is the concept of infant sexuality or child sexuality, which is a controversial and tricky and difficult subject, and one that is politicized right now in a lot of ways. There is the idea that children don't have sexuality at all, and I don't think this is true, but I do think that child sexuality is something that needs to be protected from adults and walled off and not interfered with or messed with. I just want to say that. But it's still something that is perhaps worthy of intellectual attention and analysis. So the Oedipus complex works differently for boys and girls, according to Freud. The boy directs his libido or sexual desire upon his mother, and he directs jealousy and emotional rivalry against his father, because it is he, the father, who sleeps with his mother. Natch. The boy's id wants to kill the father, as did Oedipus, hence the name, but the pragmatic ego, based upon the reality principle, knows that the father is the stronger of the two males, competing to possess the one female. Nonetheless, the boy remains ambivalent about his father's place in the family, which is manifested as a fear of castration by the physically greater father. Now, believe it or not, Freud and this whole view had influenced feminist thought and feminist criticism and gender criticism later in the 20th century a lot, because this explains why patriarchy is reproduced from generation to generation. But we'll save that for another video. Castration anxiety is an irrational, subconscious manifestation of the infantile id. There's your Oedipus complex for boys. What about for girls? Okay, how does that work? Well, rather than, and this is where it really gets iffy to me, I think, rather than castration anxiety, the girl experiences penis envy because she is anatomically incapable of sexually possessing the mother. And so, in normative healthy psychosexual development, according to Dr. Freud, she therefore redirects her desire for sexual union onto the father and progresses to heterosexual femininity, which culminates in bearing a child, which naturally is a replacement for the absent penis. Next time you see a mother holding a baby, think, congratulations on finally replacing your absent penis. Anyway, also, and this is important, so Freud would say that me being giggly about this is a manifestation of repressed anxiety about this whole thing, and really a revelation of the truth of the Oedipus complex, because I'm laughing at this. But anyway, okay. The primary erogenous zone, that is the area from which sexual pleasure is generated in normative psychosexual development, is transferred from the clitoris to the vagina, a normative view of sexuality that I think caused a lot of suffering in the 20th century for a lot of people. Not great, Freud. All right, so let's talk about a Freudian idea. Let's just shake off the Oedipus complex. Let's just shake that out. I don't want to think about that anymore. But I do want to think about the return of the repressed, which is, I think, one of Freud's coolest ideas, and one of his ideas that I think is most useful for thinking about literature and literary criticism. The return of the repressed is the idea that the things we repress, wishes, impulses, memories, reappear in disguised and unrecognizable forms, fantasies, dreams, slips of the tongue, phobias, compulsions, physical tics and pains, and they reappear in the things that we create in our art. Freud calls this this alchemical transformation of our repressed impulses and urges into artistic creation, whether it be music or painting or literature. He calls this sublimation. And to sublimate something is to make it higher, to make it greater. And for Freud, everything that made civilization was an act of sublimating our primal instincts, the urges of the id. And so when things return repressed, they never return in the form that we thought they would. They always come back distorted. The ego and the superego collaborate to censor and modify repressed material before it reaches consciousness. So types of distortion, including omission. You just leave something out. You forget to mention it. Substitution. You put something else instead of what was supposed to be there. Inversion. You make good bad, bad good, light dark, dark light. Exaggeration, condensation, and displacement. Now, those last two, the meaning of those aren't readily apparent, but they're super important for Freud's theory of dreams, which is one of the most influential aspects of Freudian thought on literary criticism. So let's talk about condensation. To condensation, dream thoughts are often combined and amalgamated into a single element of the manifest dream. So if you've ever had a dream where you wake up and you were like, wait, was that the house where I live now? Or was that the house where I grew up? Was that my elementary school? Or was that Sisliff Hall? I can't quite remember. That's condensation, right? Was that my sister or my girlfriend, right? Those are and everybody I think has experienced. Whenever I've been in a class and I says, has anybody has experienced this? Everybody's like, yes, right? So Freud, that's one for you. People and places tend to melt into composite figures in our dreams, as in metaphor. Every situation in a dream seems to be put together out of two or more impressions or experiences. The other type of distortion that takes place is displacement. And displacement in dreams, the affect or emotions associated with threatening impulses are often transferred elsewhere. They're displaced. So if you're angry at your dad, but you you shout at your boyfriend instead, this is an example of displacement. And in displacement in dreams, according to Freud's interpretation of dreams, is when we have apparently trivial elements in the manifest dream that seem to cause extraordinary distress, while what was the essence of the dream thoughts finds only passing and indistinct representation in the dream. So there's a connection in condensation. There's a connection. There's a way where one thing is associated with each other through a resemblance, and so condensation is like metaphor. With displacement, you might dream about, a sandwich that your mom ate or something like that. And so you encounter the sandwich in your dream and it makes you feel like sad or anxious or something like that. Those are feelings that you associate with your mom, but in your dream you're attaching them to the sandwich. And so that link between one signifier and a signified through just experiential association is the type of metaphor called metonymy. A dreamer may feel intense anger toward a trivial or harmless element in the dream while ignoring or overlooking a more dangerous or important one. This is displacement. So what does psychoanalytical literary criticism do? We're turning now away from Freudian theory generally and focusing more specifically on how it gets used to study literature. Well, one of the basic sort of tenets of psychoanalytical literary criticism is that literary works are public dreams or fantasies. They are revelations of the unconscious. They can't help but be. There's no random events. There are no accidents in the life of the psyche. Nothing is there that doesn't have some hidden meaning, some latent meaning. They express the unconscious wishes, impulses, and conflicts of authors and readers, or for some critics, to the society which they belong. Psychoanalytic methods uncover the hidden, and these are important psychoanalytic terms. If you're ever reading an essay or an article and you see latent or manifest, you know that the person you're reading is working in a psychoanalytical idiom. So the psychoanalytical methods uncover the hidden or latent meanings behind overt or manifest content of literary works. Symbols, metaphors, images, characters, plots, themes, and styles, that's all the manifest content. The latent content is the urges, drives, incoherences, irrational desires, and fears of authors, readers, and the society to which they belong. Psychoanalytical critics also try to understand how literary works affect readers emotionally and psychologically by evoking unconscious responses and identifications. All right, so that's basically it. And we're not going to get too into the nitty-gritty, but I want to just talk about a few of psychoanalytical critics and a few acts of psychoanalytical criticism, just to give you some examples here and some trailheads if you want to explore this further. Ernest Jones was an acolyte and a devotee of Freud. He was a real kind of Freud had his inner circle of people who were like, yes, Freud, you are right about everything. And then you would have people like Jung or Adler who would be rebellious sons. It was all very Freudian. So Ernest Jones wrote a book about Hamlet as an Oedipal drama. He argues that the reason Hamlet delays from murdering his uncle is that he feels guilt because he identifies with Claudius, because Claudius, in killing his father and sleeping with Gertrude, is doing what Hamlet unconsciously wanted to do because of why? Because of the Oedipus complex. Now, Harold Bloom argued that Freud should have just called he should have called it the Hamlet complex and not the Oedipal complex, because it's actually a better illustration than the Oedipus Rex But Harold Bloom took an interesting direction with Freudian ideas and talked about literary history as being sort of proceeding through an Oedipal anxiety of influence, where every new generation of writer wants to sort of overcome the father and take the father's place, and so that they purposely distort or misread the writing and the literary achievements of the previous generation, or of their chosen predecessor, their chosen kind of literary father. And he calls this the idea of the anxiety of influence. Norman Holland was not a Freudian. He applied a psychoanalyst named Karen Horney's concepts of neurosis and idealized self-image to Shakespeare, among others, and to how readers create meaning from text. Karen Horney is very interesting. She talks about how a lot of our suffering comes because we have this idealized self-image, and there's a gulf between our actual lives and what we think we should be like. That creates all these distortions and like irrational impulses and urges as we try to protect our ideal self-image against reality. Jacques Lacan is perhaps the most important successor to Freud. So important that I'm going to have a whole other video on Lacan down the line after we've done structuralism and post-structuralism, because for Jacques Lacan, the unconscious is structured like a language. It's a system of signs. And he talks about Poe's purloined letter as representing the desire for an impossible fullness of meaning. Julia Kristeva, working not directly with Lacan, but influenced by Lacan, developed an idea of, and Freud as well, developed the idea of intertextuality. So if you've ever heard the term intertextuality or intertextual, that comes from Kristeva. And she wrote in the 70s especially about the pleasure in making and using language and literature to bodily drives. And she's also linked to a movement in feminist criticism called French feminism, usually, which connected Freud and Freudian thought to feminist interests and concerns. Again, feminism is another video. Psychoanalysis was also appropriated and used by a number of Marxist thinkers as a way of explaining why the revolution never happened, right? What is the repression that is keeping the working class from correctly identifying their own interests as being aligned with one another's and identifying with management and the bosses and capital instead? Eric Fromm, Herbert Marcuse, Louis Althusser, and Slavoj Žižek have all combined psychoanalytical with Marxist idioms in order to kind of psychoanalyze capitalism. There's some interesting work there, and we'll talk about that more when we do our Marxist video. This has been the longest video yet, but I'm kind of low-key obsessed with Freud and Freudian thought right now. So I kind of put a little more energy into this. I hope you have found it interesting. Thank you for watching, and you may think that Freud's wrong, but Freud's always coming back. Watch out for Freud.